Before joining the Mail and Guardian, Simon worked as an African correspondent for the Daily Maverick. Let's welcome him up here to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about populism from the perspective of youth, and we have a pretty good lineup of speakers who are going to be discussing this issue with us. I'd like to welcome them all onto the stage. We have Fatima Muneer, who is here representing the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers community. She's also a research analyst at the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. We have Faith Abiodun. He's an international affairs analyst and former journalist. He's the head of program recruitment and partnerships at the African Leadership Academy. And we have, do you want to sit there? I didn't think this part of it through. We have Soud Hyder, who is with TRT World. He's the data and insights lead. And he was also a founder member of AJ+, which is one of my favorite places to get news. And we also have Chumani Maxwele, who's a political activist and one of the catalysts for the Roads Must Fall movement and Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa. So welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a few numbers. When we talk about youth on this particular continent, we are talking about a lot of people. There are 1.2 billion Africans, and over 60% of them are under the age of 25. Now let's just do a little poll in this room. Please raise your hands if you are under the age of 25. Okay, we have one, and we have a few questionable answers over there. Now, by 2050, there will be 2.4 billion Africans, and the proportion of young people is going to stay the same or grow even bigger. So when we're talking about the youth issues on this continent, we really are talking about our future. A couple of years ago, I interviewed President Olusegun Obasanjo from Nigeria, and I asked him what his greatest fear was. And he told me that the thing that keeps him awake at night is thinking about the youth of the African continent, and in particular thinking about what happens when we don't manage this youth explosion, when we don't give the youth the education and the resources they need to make lives for themselves. How do those energies, how do those fears and frustrations of a youth that are not satisfied with their lot in life, how do they manifest on the political space? I want to give you one quote from, this is from former President Jakaya Kikwete, which I think really outlines how serious an issue this is. By 2050, he says, Africa will be home to 1 billion young people. By 2030, if current trends persist, only 1 in 10 young people will be on track to gain basic secondary level skills in low-income countries, the majority of which are in Africa. Simply put, we now risk compromising the future of an entire generation. Now, I think when we talk about youth, we also need to talk about this idea of populism. What is it? How are politicians using it? And how are these sort of twin trends of populism and a growing youth movement, or youth, the sort of demographics, how are they going to intersect with each other and impact how we make change on this continent and how we make positive change on this continent, and of course elsewhere around the world. And we're going to discuss these issues today. We are going to start with Soud. Will you lead us off?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Simon has given me this unusual task of opening the session, so hopefully by the time I'm done, there'll still be hope and promise for the other panelists to add on. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers and the organizing committee from the Common Action Forum for inviting all of us and bringing this much needed conversations to Africa and hopefully assisting in framing these problems from an African narrative. I'm Kenyan and I'm proudly African. Despite the fact that I inadvertently got a very unwelcome passive-aggressive welcome from the South African immigration when I handed over my Kenyan passport, which looks like an American passport, and by the time she saw that it looks like a Kenyan passport, asked me a whole series of questions. And the last time I was asked such questions was when I visited Italy. And anyway, it is what it is, and these are the challenges that we face in modern Africa, and with people moving around and so on and so forth. So I'll start by giving an introduction into, or a timeline of populist activities, or significant populist activities from the 1920s till 2018. And I'll start by reading off from a quote that a good friend of mine who's in attendance sent me. And this is from Thomas Edward Watson. He is a populist from Georgia and ended up becoming a senator sometime in the early 1900s. And he started out from the left, and he advocated for the views of poor people, both black and white, in America, and then in the American South. And by the time he got to Senate, he was on the extreme right and only advocating for views of one identity and using sub-identities to divide people. And what he said in 1910, he said, "The scum of creation has been dumped on us. Some of our principal cities are more foreign than American. The most dangerous and corrupting hordes of the old world have invaded us. The vice and crime which they have planted in our midst are sickening and terrifying. What brought these Goths and Vandals to our shores? The manufacturers are mainly to blame. They wanted cheap labor, and they didn't care a curse of how much harm to our future might be in the consequence of their heartless policy." 1910, 2018, same script. So, and looking at the rise of populism after the First World War, looking in the 1920s and 1930s, with what Hitler did and what Mussolini did in Italy. On one hand, you had Nazism, which is, a populist movement. And on the other hand, you had what Mussolini was predominantly fascist and caused a lot of trouble in that part of the world. And then in the 1940s, pre and post World War II, there was a lot of populist ideas and protectionism that was being brought about. In the 1960s, we moved to a more slightly liberal view of populism with the civil rights movements, anti-colonialism, and then going forward in the 70s, 80s, and up to the early 2000s, we had liberalism and neoliberalism as popular movements. And around the same time, newly independent states, which was a recent phenomenon in the 60s and 70s, especially in the global south, gave rise to sub-identities in order to prevail or to govern from the structures that were imposed on them from a colonial point of view. And especially coming from part of the Commonwealth, the common way of governing was dividing and ruling, where you split people on tribal lines, religious lines, to be able to adequately govern with minimal resources. And 2006, you saw what happened with Obama and Obama mania. And, the hope, the promise, he was seen as, the digital president. He organized using social media. And, it was a form of populism as well. 2011, we had the Arab Spring, which unfortunately was short-lived by 2013. But, new technologies were used to organize people and give rise to ideas that challenged the status quo. 2016, another successive populist movement in the US. So we moved from Obama to Trump, from the left or center-left to somewhat to the extreme right, in succession. And the same tools are being used. The same tools Obama used are the same tools that Trump used. On one hand, this digital and social media was used for voter inclusion. On the other hand, Trump used it for voter seclusion. And then 2018, look at what's happening across Europe, what's just happened in Brazil. And so these are just waves that are happening. And look at also what happened in India with the Modi government. it's neither right or left. Yes, the right seems to be winning now. But at certain points, the left was popular in most parts of the world, or most parts of what you call the developed world. And these are evolutionary cycles. So yes, as much glimmer and darkness we see within our shores or neighborhoods, or what's happening in major countries of influence, it is a series of issues that haven't been addressed. And fundamentally, you're looking at the rise of right-wing politics. They've used the same tools, and these are also being legitimately elected governments. So maybe the question is there a problem with how we frame democracies and the democracy process? Because part of the problem that we're seeing is we're working with constitutions, we're working with frames of reference and governance, right, of which were designed to work in the industrial age and haven't really been upgraded to work in the 21st century in terms of how people are organizing and how information is spreading and how participants in government need to interact with the representatives or call government into account. And case in point, I'll give you a good example. As I grew up in Kenya, we've had a series of issues in Kenya which called for constitutional reform. And the biggest callers for constitutional reform, both during Moi's era and Kibaki's era in Kenya, was the US and the UK, right? Look at what happened with the UK with Brexit, and look at what happened in the US with the midterms, where they're in pretty much a legislative impasse. It's a divided house, and there is a problem with US politics. So if there are countries that are in dire need of constitutional reform in the democratic world, I would argue that the US should come first, and Britain should come a close second, because there are fundamental issues with the way these democracies are being run, right? And it's a class-based systems. It only represents a certain element of society, and this can be misused, especially in the case of America. It can be misused by people with very divisive politics in order to get to office. Now, fundamentally, growing up in I wouldn't say Kenya is a thriving democracy, a very young democracy like Kenya. The SI unit of democracy has always been either the UK, because we're part of the Commonwealth and we have similar legal systems, or the US. But there is a lot of introspection that we need, and especially I'm talking as a young African, of what is the solution of African democracies, right? And the gentleman, Honorable Park Stow, who opened today's session, mentioned that the South African constitution, although seen as complex and revolutionary, is not being used in other parts of the world. And just as a point of correction, is the Kenyan constitution borrowed a lot from the South African constitution, right? But these are the stories that we as Africans don't pride ourselves in finding African solutions. Ambassador Dango, talked about maybe the alternative to the problem in Libya should have been a homeward-looking solution. So as a youth, as a member of the youth in Africa, and as an African, I think it's high time we start looking at these issues from an African perspective and looking for African solutions to these problems. And Africa is growing. It's being paraded and charaded to all parts of the world. For good chunk of the last 10 years, the Chinese have been doing a lot of activity in Africa, and all of a sudden the West has woken up. And you see Theresa May and Angela Merkel were in Africa recently, but Britain is trying to rethink its position in Africa. And I'll give you the example that Britain's diplomacy is being used in Africa over the last, especially in Kenya over the last couple of months. It's very shallow. It's very symbolic of the nature of that fractured relationship, because some of the things that Britain is doing in Kenya as part of the diplomatic efforts, and I see no reason why us as Africans, all Kenyans and young Kenyans should entertain this, is, they'll rock up, the ambassador will rock up, the high commissioner will rock up one day, have some activities and say, so Britain is holding a good chunk of Kenyan money that was laundered for corruption, and they'll say they use the proceeds of that money to help Kenya. And they'll rock up one day and donate 2 ambulances. Kenya is a growing economy, we can afford to buy ambulances for ourselves. This is not what we need. About 6 weeks ago, the British High Commissioner goes to the Public Prosecutor's Office, donates 2 high-speed scanning machines, right? And this is the type of diplomacy that we are entertaining as Africans. And I think as African youth, we need to call this out and say, guys, enough is enough. If our government wants to accept these meager symbolic gestures as the type of diplomacy or progress that we need, we need to call it out. And there has to be a change. And it's reached a point now where the status quo has to be challenged. And the future of the continent lies within the youth, because the youth are the numbers. And unfortunately, most popular movements have used the youth as catalysts to change, but not the drivers of change. And that's why we have catastrophic failures of populist movements, because a significant constituent component of society is being marginalized. They used to get people to power, but they're not actively participating in the process. So that's probably now the future of governance models, is how do the largest constituents of these populations take their affairs in their hands or call governments to account. And lastly, governments have to change, politics has to change. If there's any significant, I'd speak with this as a bias because I'm a technologist, and we've seen technology growing and creating problems. It's creating a lot of solutions, but at the same time, we also, as technologists, we're creating a lot of problems. And there's an element of ethics that now is being advocated within the technology industry. But if you look at areas where areas of society or specialisms in society that haven't really grown, is that of governance and policy making. Look at what happened when the Cambridge Analytica scandal went all up on both sides of the Atlantic, and the questions policymakers were asking, the entrepreneurs or the firms, they're completely out of date, and that's the problem. Government and policymakers haven't really adapted to the change. There is no government model that is suited for the 21st century, and that is the problem that we need to solve.
Wonderful. Thank you, Soud, for that very comprehensive overview. Faith, would you like to take the conversation forward?
Sure, absolutely. See if I'm on. All right, great. Thanks very much for the chance to be here. Many thanks to Common Action Forum for inviting me. The last time I participated in the forum was in 2015 at the inaugural session in Madrid, and it actually sparked some of the thoughts that I will share shortly. Today I want to speak about 3 or 4 key points. First, I want to talk about what I see as the impact of populism on a political state, and particularly how it affects the youthful population in the state. Secondly, I want to speak about what I see as some of the current impediments to credible youthful participation in politics, and what I think, or how I think populism helps to grow that. Thirdly, I want to address what I see as future scenarios in politics, in global politics generally, and what I think a forum like this can do to steer us either in one direction or away from the other direction. And lastly, I'll just address 1 or 2 recommendations that I have for how I think we can reform the future of politics. We haven't yet defined populism, and I think there are lots of definitions of populism, but at the center of all these definitions is a sense of polarizing populations and utilizing the tactic of fear to pursue narrow-ended objectives. And so whether that is a nationalist agenda or racial agenda, it always thrives on fear, and it always seeks to polarize populations one way or the other. And so how do instances of populism change the nature of politics, or how does this influence the state? And particularly, how does it influence the youthful population in a state? I think the first thing that populism does is to embolden extremists. there are extremists in society no matter where you look. And the moment a populist agenda shows up, it emboldens those extremists who otherwise begin to shift towards the extremes. But now they're going to come close to the center, and public discourse is dominated by extremism because they have now been emboldened by a rogue strongman politician, a strongwoman politician, as we say in France. The second thing that I think populism does is to terrify passive reformists. If there are people who are thinking about playing a role, an active role in society, the moment a populist agenda rears its head, they get shot down quietly and they begin to rethink what were very credible ideas. And people begin to think that it's perhaps best to just avoid politics at all costs and spend more time in academia, writing papers and sitting on panels, rather than actually engaging the systems that are challenging what happens in society. On a positive spin, one of the things that populism does is to energize activists. And you see in America, there's a rise of the youth voice all of a sudden. Anyone who monitored the last midterm elections in the US would have noticed how much of a movement there was by young people to take a stand and to influence politics and to go out and vote in record numbers. And that's one of the positive influences of populism. But to touch on something that what I talked about yesterday, which was fighting for the right to silence, I think that the other really disappointing outcome of populism is that it almost eliminates centrists. And people who want to play at the center find themselves being shifted either along with the far right or going far left. And the absence of centrism in politics becomes another difficult outcome of populism. So you see people who are extremists having a louder voice. You see people who are passive reformists being completely shut down. You see people who are activists being strengthened and finding a voice. And then you see those who are centrists almost being kicked out of society. But how do all these affect the youth population specifically and young people who are trying to cut their teeth in politics and governance? I think the first thing that it does is to deepen a sense of ignorance in the youthful population about the real issues. Young people these days get swept up to agitation without a clear understanding of what they're agitating about. And not to say that everyone does this, but I have seen, certainly in my generation, a spin towards hashtag activism, BuzzFeed activism, now this activism, and not to call them AJ Plus, but AJ Plus activism. A sense of looking for a soundbite or a headline and running head-on with it without having a clear understanding of what the roots of these issues are. And that is a very terrible outcome, because now you are activating and you are agitating about things on which you're not properly educated. The second thing I see that infects a youthful population is that populism leads to a perpetuation of skepticism and fear. It becomes very hard to think about the role one might play. I was thinking about this morning. Assuming there was a 15-year-old somewhere in America who began to watch TV or engage with the media about 3 years ago, in 2016 when Donald Trump began to gain prominence. By now, that child is 18 years old, going to vote for the first time. They've been infected by 3 years of vitriol. I wonder how enthusiastic they are about the future of the world. Because now there's a sense of skepticism and fear and othering of all kinds of populations, which doesn't allow for a centrist conversation or center-left or center-right-wing conversation. The third thing that populism does to youthful population is to challenge globalization and to shrink the world around itself. It becomes very hard to think about the fact that we're all stronger together and we all sing together. The sense of populism that infects a youthful population that hasn't grown through different eras is that globalization begins to look like a false idea or an unacceptable idea. And fourthly, I think populism infects a youthful population by stifling participation and stifling any kind of political involvement, whether by voting or by joining a political party or by advocating in the media. There's just a sense of who wants to die? Because politics is just not for us. It's for those people who are very, very bad. And all of these are emboldened by populist agenda. Now, three things I see as current impediments to credible youthful participation in politics. Firstly is this sense of skepticism. Why vote? Why join a political party? Why expect anything from your government? It's just not the thing you do. You know, you have the sense of nothing is ever going to change. What's it ever going to take for anything to change? Those guys don't like us. Those guys don't think like us. So the skepticism that grows in the youthful population stops them from wanting to join any type of political movement. The second I want to touch on is ignorance, very, very deep ignorance. I began to ask myself after CAF in 2015, sitting in Madrid at the Wellington Hotel, I was asking myself, what's it going to take for someone like me to get involved in government in my home country of Nigeria or across the continent? What's it going to take? What's my pathway? Why should an intelligent, vibrant, exciting young person think about a role in politics? If I, for some reason, because I spent half my career in education, if I got appointed some way to the Ministry of Education, what will my role be in changing education? I just don't know. There's a deep sense of ignorance that prevents engagement. And the third is really about this pathways. Should I, for instance, join a political party when I can't see anyone in any of the new political parties in my country who I can think about as a role model? There is no credible modeling of pathways into politics for young people, so why even think about it in the first place? And if we think about what the future of politics might look like, having looked at what populism does to populations, there are two scenarios that are very, very clear to me. One which, what I tried to steer us away from yesterday, saying that globalization will become the order of the day again, and populism and right-wing politics will not last for very long. I'm going to touch on that very shortly. But the first very real scenario which we're dealing with today is one in which populism drives right-wing politics, which then becomes the order of the day across the world. And previously, we were only talking about America and a bit of Europe, but now we've added South America to it. You can talk about Brazil, and we've added the Philippines to it with Duterte. And this is now touching on almost every region of the continent. We don't have many extreme examples on the continent today, but they're very far off. I think dictatorship and authoritarianism will become the order of the day if this scenario comes to life. Because that is certainly what Duterte is pushing in the Philippines. That is what Donald Trump is pushing in America, believing that you can rule by fiat. You can make a statement from Twitter and then the world follows you. That's a push towards authoritarianism and dictatorship. I think that journalism and public criticism will become very, very stifled, even more so than it is today. And it's already very scary to think about how difficult it is to publicly criticize anything. I think that jungle justice will become the order of the day, and judicial systems will be extremely weakened, because judicial officers will begin to pander to the tweets of a president, especially when you get a chance to fill the Supreme Court with folks who look like you. And I think if you look at Rwanda itself, which is an African example today, it's very, very hard to be in opposition to the government. You can get 22 years in jail if you try to stand against the president of Rwanda. And I think that activists will begin to populate government, which is perhaps not a very good thing. And I think that elections would also become a bit of a charade. And lastly, I think on that point that politics will become very less intellectual, which is, again, a very scary scenario for the continent. I also believe that youth participation in politics will become cursory, and that new entrants into politics will often be proteges of the exact same populists whom we despise. And so, if this will not be the case, this very dire scenario will not be the case, if we will get a chance to switch into something that what I was trying to guide us towards, and which I hope that Common Action Forum would lead towards, I question what it's going to take to have a more centrist, globally aware, intellectual world. I've got 3 recommendations. My first is for some type of training or political school for aspiring political leaders, or a pathway that allows for people to think about the fact that they might have a role to play in government, for instance. About a decade ago, the world realized that there was a dearth of scientists and engineers in the world. And so we began to speak about STEM education everywhere across the world, STEM, 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 STEM. And those who are arts-oriented said, hey, we've got to add A to it, so let's have STEAM, 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 STEAM. And, oh, we don't have enough girls in school, let's have a girls' education movement. But when are we going to have a movement that trains and prepares people for life in politics? Or for having credible public sector leaders? What's it going to take to have people like us, who are very intellectual, who are committed, who are passionate about change, to actually approach the systems of governance and think about how we can make reforms from the inside, rather than spend our lives on panels and go to conferences? I wonder what it's going to take to have a set of qualifications for governance. Do you just have to look like it to be a political leader? Do you just have to speak like it to be a political leader? What are your yardsticks for deciding who leads you? My second recommendation is for us to work towards lowering the barriers to entry into politics or into governance. Politics is extremely lucrative in the continent and across the world, and the barriers to entry are extremely high. For a young person like me to think about entering into governance in my country, the cost of picking an application form to run for office will scare me for generations to come. So why would I even think that I've got a role to play? Who might bankroll my campaign to start with? I feel like I might have to pander towards the exact same systems that I despise in order to have a chance to even enter politics. So why bother? Who could my role models be? Whose ideas would I try to leverage if I can't set credible models of what it looks like? My final point is that media coverage and analysis of right-wing extremism has got to change. What you pay attention to is going to grow as much as it can. And it really befuddles me that I have to watch CNN every now and then, because I don't think they have a clue what to do with themselves beyond Donald Trump. And the more you pay attention to and you fan the wind of extremism, the more the world thinks this is the new normal. And so I would very much like to see an emboldening of the media to steer the narrative in a very different direction. That is not just what right-wing extremism is very bad, and we have no clue what the difference might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faith. I think one of the most important points you made in that presentation was that panel discussions, as interesting as they may be, are no substitute for real action. And that's something we must all remember as we continue to listen to more panel discussions today. Fatima.
Yeah, I would like to present from the podium. To start off, I want to congratulate Mr. Wada Confer and his team at the Common Action Forum for dedicating an entire panel focusing on youth for the first time in the history of the organization's annual forums. On behalf of my co-panelists, I would like to thank you and the Common Action Forum for allowing us to engage in this dialogue. To me, it shows that to you, our voices matter. I'm Fatima Muneer, a World Economic Forum Global Shaper at the Ottawa Hub in Canada, and it is my great privilege to be speaking with you all today. I want to use the time that I've been given for this presentation to talk about ideas, some of which have already been implemented and that can potentially prevent today's toxic populism from infecting countries further, and hence build a better future for all of us. In 2015, I was chosen by the World Economic Forum as one of the 50 global shapers from around the world to participate in the annual forum in Davos. I was told that the World Economic Forum tries to give young people like myself a seat at the same table of some of the world's key decision makers. I saw this for myself when the forum nominated me and 3 other global shapers to moderate a private session with former French President François Hollande at Davos that year. Now, this was around 2 weeks after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, and during the session, I was surprised when I, despite being only 24 at that time, was asked to share my ideas with the president on how to integrate the diverse but not so cohesive French society better. I suggested to him that it was necessary to incorporate the concept of diversity within the educational model of French schools. Because if children grow up constantly exposed to other cultures, heritages, and religions, through books and activities designed to encourage inclusive diversity, then the idea of those who are different, and therefore the other, can be minimalized. Now, not only did the president, Mr. François Hollande, tell me that he liked my idea, but shortly after Davos, I was contacted by Ariana Huffington and asked to blog about my idea on diversity education on the Huffington Post. As a young person, this event showed me that my voice mattered. At the Global Shapers Ottawa Hub, of which I am a member, as was previously mentioned, early this year, to celebrate Canada's G7 presidency as we were the host of the 2018 G7 summit, we partnered with hubs from other G7 countries from around the world and held youth consultations on different G7 themes. For us in the Ottawa hub, we held a youth consultation on jobs of the future, an issue that happens to be on top of our priority list. We invited youth from all over Ottawa, from all walks of life, and gathered their insights and ideas on the topic. Our hub was then invited by the Honourable Navdeep Bains, who happens to be Canada's Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, to present the findings of our consultation. To have been afforded the chance to have our voices heard for key policy making, it showed to us that our voices matter. When policies about unemployment are in discussion, young people who are unemployed need to be involved. When policies on immigrants and refugees are in discussion, young people who are immigrants and refugees need to be involved. If we truly want to build an inclusive future that speaks to all of us, we need to ensure that all voices are heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Chumani,
Yeah.
your turn.
Thank you. Igama lami ngichumani Maxwele. Undlovu udlamini sidle ekhaya nxa kuswele umalusi. Umyalo umbodo uthoyana ulanga uboni. Uziza ujama usijada phakade umlamba wala uzozibona kuphela. Abantu bakuthi ke abadala esithi sihambe nabo ngamaxesha onke xa sizakwenza izinto. Sihamba phambi kwabo bayasincedisa amaxesha onke. By that, I'm introducing myself. And of course, many of times, we talk about Africa. And yet, every time we talk about Africa, we get away from Africa. And part of that, you realize that, in fact, we're getting away from ourselves. And yet, we're talking about ourselves. Now, these are the challenges that we, as young people, are battling with, the idea of getting away from yourself. And yet, you want to reclaim or talk about yourself. And of course, today, I'm not here to talk about that. We are asked to come and talk about the idea of the future of politics. I presume that in African context, and of course globally, and of course the idea of populism, or populist politics. I want to begin with the idea that most of the time there's a negative connotation attached with populism. But in truth, there's no politics without populism. That's the reality of the matter. Mandela was the populist of the highest order. You cannot argue otherwise about that. You cannot be a global figure without being a populist. That's the reality. But there's this strong negative connotation about being an agitator of popular politics. For me, I take the positive connotation about it, that politics must be popular. Without you being popular, you are not in politics. Because politics is about that which is popular with the people. If people are not interested in it, then might as well not be popular. But if it affects the people, therefore, it ought to be popular. As a populist, someone who understands the importance of the popular politics, you have to speak to those issues. And then in South African politics, the moment you speak about popular questions, you are a populist, you are negative, destructive, popular. For me, I find it very strange. And of course, it speaks to our politics, the nature of our politics, whether in the media or in the mainstream. But in answering the question of the future of South African or African or global politics, I think the future is bright. It's bright on two bases. The first one, that the old must die and the young must be born. That's the reality of the matter. It's not happen if the future ought to be bright. The second one is really taking the idea of popular politics very serious. Make an example of Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, which I was part of from the onset. It was a popular movement, still a popular movement. While we managed to rally young people and ultimately rally the state, it's not an easy thing to have a state president to stop everything that he was doing, together with his ministry, to say, look, we are sitting on this issue that we are talking about. We've had you, we're making a declaration, there will be no free increment. That's a serious thing. That's very serious. I take it very serious. And I know that many young people take it very serious. When the president called the SRCs in your buildings, we, the student movement, who are outside SRC, and remember that Rose Must Fall, Fees Must Fall was not led by SRCs as a formal structure of the state. I was in Cape Town in Stellenbosch, protesting against the inaugural ceremony of them, the current Vice-Chancellor. And then other comrades, of course, came here in union buildings. But what was interesting was that the state was still resistant to listen to the popular movement outside the formal structures. No, let's call the SRCs, they're a bit formal. Let's let them hear us. What do I say? And then we said, no, because we are not petty in our politics. We said, okay, comrades, you can go, because they are part of us. The SRC, the student, the activists, the part of us, they went and they came back. No, the president says A, B, and C. And they said, okay, that's fine. Now, without populism, without popular politics, without populist activists, there was no way that we could be able to rally the South African politics the way we did. There was no way. Whether you're using social media to talk about big slogans or using television interviews to sloganize, that's populism. That's very important, to galvanize the popular ideas. Even those who were sitting at home who thought that this was, in fact, a non-issue, they woke up to the reality that there is something that is coming out. But I mentioned these two aspects that I think they ought to be part and parcel of our future if our politics are to be successful. Why I'm saying the old must die? In Africa today, I mean, I go to the South African Parliament because I'm based in Cape Town regularly to come listen to the debates. And then if you look to the members of Parliament, it's scary. I mean, I feel the pain of these young people. It's scary. You see, old grannies. And then you ask, this comrade, is he really going to go to Kenya today and tomorrow to Nigeria and the next day to Kigali? There's no way. But why our leaders are keeping these people there? Why? This is what is going to kill our politics. That's it. Simple. Okay? Now, they must die so that the future of Africa can be reborn. It's as simple as that. And I I hope when I reach their level, I'll be proudly a mentor, a proud mentor. Someone who says, I'm happy to mentor you. One of the biggest challenges in South Africa, Mr. Gozi, is a poor mentorship. Absolutely poor mentorship. You know, Rose must fall, fees must fall. One of the brilliant, smartest young people have led that movement in its complex structure, in terms of it was a flat structure. We had no leaders, in a sense that we fully understood what Chimamanda or Sisonke, between the two, call the big men and women politics. Because we knew that we have a problem in this country of big men, big women politics. And then we left the movement structureless. But here is the movement today, plus and minus 50 masters and PhD researchers are coming to South Africa to research on fees must fall and rose must fall from across the world. So research. We have not counted those ones in South Africa. And yet, our leaders, both the private and public, they know these young people. I can tell you now, if you have any single young person who says, I've been approached by so and so, want to mentor me, want to give me guidance, want to help me to propel me to the next stage away from the student body. None whatsoever. I know one of the greatest young people. Now, within the movement, of course, there's a question of elitism in South Africa. And naturally, our movement was an elitist movement in the sense that it happened in a university. University, by its virtue, it's an elitist structure. And within the university, you then have the affluent kids and the poor kids. And of course, now I've got one of my comrades who wrote a book who says that the movement was led by the coconuts. Partly means that by the elite kids. But it's partly true, partly not. It's not true in the sense that the movement was led by the poorest of the poor who find themselves at Wits University, at UCT, at Stellenbosch, who then realize that there's nothing else I can do but to raise popular voice. It's a serious thing not to be able to pay fees. At UCT, you will be kicked out by not having money. And yet these people, they've accepted you on the basis that you are poor. But the moment they realize that you can't pay even that which they put as a standard, and they realize, no, go home. There are many young people before 2015 who were kicked out of UCT because they couldn't pay money. And for us, we knew this is wrong. Okay? But it was our generation who said, no, I cannot suffer alone. Because you know when you receive the letters from the university, you receive alone, mostly at night. It seems like the system arrived, it's set to send letters at night. You receive these things at night, and you're like, shit. They're telling you that by March, you register February, by March or April, you must be paid so much. But these people, they knew that I didn't have money, but they wanted. And if you don't want, it's easy, they will cancel your student account, and you can't do anything. Now, I'm trying to say, I really am of the view that if we want to change, or if we have a really serious interest in the future of Africa, that the old must die. And I really want to emphasize this question of mentorship. You know, I recently met with a senior official in the Department of Higher Education, and they had a one-day symposium on decolonization. And decolonization has been at the corner of Rose Must Fall and Fees Must Fall student movement. And of course, they've taken the idea. We are happy about that your ideas are taken to task and they're taken seriously by the government. But what they do, they're not including students. They're not including student leaders. Why? Because they want to keep that position for themselves. They must be the one who generate ideas, but they will not acknowledge that they took your ideas. They don't want you to go and implement those ideas so that you can grow in that process. That's a tragedy. If you can go anywhere in the global north, young people are taken in serious forums, in serious engagement, in serious mentorship programs, because the potential has been seen. And the reason for that is really partly because of the ANC. I mean, ANC is the biggest problem. But it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem. ANC, you know, it's hard to imagine these leaders and our fathers to do anything about society that they can't do it for themselves. There are many young people who were groomed by the ANC who are still waiting in the lobby while old people are inside parliament. There are many. You can think of them. There are many. They're sitting in the lobby waiting for these comrades to get out or die. I mean, why? Why is that the case? Now, you can't therefore imagine this leader of society, so it claims, to then imagine things outside itself when it cannot do it by themselves. In closing, I want to really emphasize and say, look, in May, I went to Senegal. There was a gathering of African activists. And seriously there, you realize the pain of Africa. Mr. Kosi, we have faith in you that you will then take seriously the voice of young people to the global community. There's these young people in Senegal of Opel. It's a popular movement there. They call all young people to come together. When we arrive there, you hear the stories of young people from Congo, from Cameroon. These are activists from Cameroon, South Sudan, Kenya, and so on. Painful stories. And South African story, of course, now suddenly you come with a successful story, government listen to you. No, they tell you, no, you've got it easy, man. Sit down. Yeah, of course, you must sit down. You have it all easy. There, to a young person who raise issues, you get killed or you disappear. Here in Africa. What is it that we ought to do, Mr. Fagudi, to really help these young people in the African continent who are activists, who want to be given a platform to communicate with their government? The South African challenge of old people in parliament is across, you go to Cameroon. More than 36 years of governance, the president still wants to sit in again. What is that? And now, help us to really give back to the new future of Africa through making sure that the mentorship of those young people in Congo, in Kigali, and so on, can be able to be brought on board in the national stage and echo their voices so that we are nothing without them. They can be able to provide change in Africa. That's why I'm saying, for me, populism is very important. Because, as my colleague was saying, that ignorance can kick easily. People can choose to be ignorant. I'm not interested. There's so many young people in this country who received a very good education, who are now in private sector, whom, if they were to be absorbed in politics, our politics would be very progressive. We will do amazing things. But because of the ills, politics is not supposed to be only for those who have got slogans, only for those who speak louder than others. No. It's supposed to be the educated sport of the educated people. People who drive policy, laws, direction of the country. But currently in South Africa, politics is based on how loud you are. That's why people were shocked that UCT student can say roads must go down. Why? Are you bored? No, we're not bored. We see something is wrong. Why that student who's supposed to be comfortably having everything, why would they say fees must fall? After all, they are not the majority who are affected by fees. But because we realize that if we do not make politics what it ought to be, that it must be a tool to change society will be left behind. Remember, there's still a lot of young people who are in the deep rural communities of our country. Deep rural. You go to Engobo, Mtata, the deep KZN, Mpumalanga, you realize that young people are left behind. You are still talking within the urban settings. When we get there, you know, if we don't do these things, you see, it was easy to mobilize young people within Fees Must Fall. But my fear, one day, a populist leader will rally the young people of this country in the township, and the war will break out. That's my fear. If you can easily, highly educated young people be easily rallied on Roads Must Fall, on Fees Must Fall, and really believe in this thing, what about those who got nothing to lose in the township of our country, in the rural areas of our country? This country can go down. And for me, I think these forums are important to really heighten our consciousness and really run away from the deliberate ignorance that can happen so that we can avert some of these things. And I'm happy then, because part of being an activist is that you're not just a panelist, but you're talking about something that you have done. And you are prepared to do it. You are always on the ground. And I think that it is up to us, those who claim to be educated, who have been given opportunity to learn and interpret and analyze things, and really can do something. I mean, recently, President Barack Obama, I was reading all his Facebook and tweets about the need to vote for this past election. And if you listen to Barack, he gives this historical involvement of himself, being a community organizer. And that, for me, is what is missing in South Africa. People immediately, they got degrees, they have nothing to do with the community. And South Africa is based on a community. Without the community, without the growth of the community, without the political education of the community, South Africa is nothing. In those words, let me sit down and then we'll engage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invoke the moderator's privilege to ask the first question. And that is, as you have so beautifully outlined, the sort of normal way of doing things isn't working for youth of today. If you grow up in today's world, if you were born 10 years ago, you've grown up in a world where you've been told, as long as you can remember, that climate change is probably going to end the world you live in within a few decades, that the fourth industrial revolution will take all your jobs, and you cannot see any pathways to political influence in the normal system. In this context, surely populism, whether it is the populism of the right, which involves denying a lot of these problems, or the populism of the left, which involves thinking of a brand new system to throw away the old in with the new, surely populism is the only rational response to the world we find ourselves in. Anyone want to take that question?
I'll try, for my concern. I think we still have to figure out what an acceptable definition of populism is. Now, you talked about the fact that it almost tends towards a negative spin. The raw definition of populism itself is not negative. But when it gets attached to nationalism or any type of ism that doesn't lead towards acceptable centrist ideology, then it becomes very negative. So if we take populism as an idea, it revolves around finding a certain set of buzzwords that drive public policy of some sort. So in America, which is the one that we know, and sadly we have kids in America because that's what the media reports all the time, the brand of populism we have right now is advocating for a new national reality in which non-Americans aren't priority. Not only are they not priority, they're not welcome, and they're not respected, they're not allowed to exist as they are. Could that ever be acceptable? The answer is no. What would be the opposite? Or if you flip the coin, it becomes extreme acceptance. Everyone is welcome to share what everyone has. Is that equally acceptable? Not necessarily. The question is, what is the center? What does it take to exist in a system in which we are all welcome, we're all allowed to thrive? which is why I'm advocating for, I'm asking for a type of debate that centers itself on issues, socioeconomic issues and political issues. What does it take for a government to exist and to serve all of its citizens in equal measure? What does it take for countries to cooperate to ensure that regardless of where a person comes from, or what their qualifications or what their skills are, they're able to participate in public debate, they're able to access public resources, they're able to exist. Any of the extremes is not great. And I don't think a populist agenda is sustainable long-term. Whether right-wing populism or left-wing populism, it's not sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, why advocate for it? Something in the center that allows for everyone to be allowed to exist as they are and to pursue all their freedoms in the complexity and in the entirety must be the only sustainable long-term approach. If it's not sustainable long-term, why kick it off in the first place? That's my thought.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know about the idea of the center. I'm trying to really think about it, the idea of the center. Who is sitting at the center? What is the center? Politically. What is the center? I suppose these are the challenges, the question that we must be able to answer. I don't know. I'm sure my colleague, maybe not here, but later on. But my imagination about the possibility of the center, it's almost the indifference. People are not really interested, but they're there. I'm not interested. But there's something interesting for me about people who take a stand. I mean, of course, even this idea of left and right, it's very narrow. Left, right. Why? I want to argue that with time and space, people change their ideas and their politics and their position. Here and now, in South Africa, you've got a question of the poorest of the poor, subject of the apartheid project. Politically, where do you stand as a political astute person? We've got a history of the apartheid, a history of colonialism. What do we do about that? We're here now. People are saying they want their land. What is center about? Are you going to take a position of the center there? No, people want their land. What must we do? Of course, President Beggy insists that here is this country, is ours. All of us who belong to it must share what we have. But good, well, that's correct. We are here, all of us. But you go to Stellenbosch. Those comrades are not interested in sharing. You hear? No, that's good. It's good. It's a good ideal that we must share. We all belong here. But the comrades in Stellenbosch are not interested in sharing. What stand am I going to take about that? Am I being a populist? Am I being a right-winger to say, look, no, something must be done about that? My brother, all of us here, very civil, we can talk about it, but there will come a time, a populist leader, take the land. There's no debate there, take the land. And the people are in their majority, they will take the land. And the ANC won't be there. Remember, the people who are there in the ANC leadership are the very negotiators of why we are in this mess we are in. They are the ones who negotiated. They won't be there come 20 years down the line, and the land will be taken. It's an opportunity now. That's why I'm saying there's no need for me to be in the center about the land question, about the education of this country, about the poor people in this country. I can't take the position of the center because I don't know this position. I must take the extreme position that the poorest of the poor must be brought to the mainstream of the economy. They must participate in the mainstream of the economy of our country. They must participate in the mainstream of our politics. If I cannot be able to do that, then I have a problem. That's my view. Hence, I'm saying populism must serve to address and redress the historical injustice of the past in order to heal the society. Everyone knows. I ran in Constantia as part of touring this town, this country of ours. Constantia, Bishop's Court, and so on. And I asked myself, Bishop Mukhoba is our leader. Bishop Mukhoba stays in Bishop's Court. And I asked myself, how can this leader stay here? How does it feel every day? How? How does it feel? Bishop's Court is totally white. Constantia is totally white. It's a big piece of land. And then you go to Khayelitsha, people bend down. They're bent down completely. Everyone is shocked and so on. But there's a correlation there. You go to Miningberg, people are killing each other, Hanover Park and so on. And if you go to history, you're told, no, the people who are in Hanover Park, in fact, they belong in Newlands. They were removed from Newlands. How can I take a center stage on that? No. My populist ideals say, no, we must invade Constantia. We must invade Constantia. That's my view. Yeah, thank you.
If I may, I just wanted to add the fact that this is not a political science class, but the idea of centrist politics doesn't equate to pacifism. Not the same thing, right? Saying a centrist ideology is perhaps more sustainable long-term does not equate to the fact that people mustn't take a stand. That is pacifism. It means allow life to take its course. You might well know nothing changes over time. Things only change by deliberate action. That's always been constant. And so where we have been drawn to the extreme left, the only way to find the center becomes the extreme right movement, and then we get on again to the extreme left, and we're instead of constant agitation, which is not sustainable in any society. And therefore, centrism focuses on dialogue. Politics by itself is very complex because it's related to human behavior, which is extremely complex. So can 3 or 4 of us have the same ideas about how to solve any one problem? Never. But if one of us takes an extreme right-wing position, the other of us takes an extreme left-wing position, the others of us, to stabilize the conversation, are going to be a little bit centrist, allowing the voice or the sense from this side to be accepted, the sense or the rationale behind that conversation to be accepted, and then collectively through dialogue, find out what might satisfy either of both parties without subjugating the other. That's what political centrism is about. It's not about taking a passive approach or allowing life to take its course, because that never leads us anywhere.
We're running very short on time, but I want to take a couple of questions. Questioners, please keep your questions very short and sharp. And panelists, please keep your answers short and sharp so we can get in as much discussion as possible.
I've just typed in the word centrist, and it says offering a practical solution and opposing political extremes. So for centrists in the USA, a practical solution is to impeach Donald Trump. A centrist in the UK would be to have a second referendum on the Brexit. A centrist in France may be to support Emmanuel Macron against Le Pen. Are these solutions, or are these kind of centrist ways just glossing over the cracks? And hasn't that been a problem for centrist politics over the past 20 years? Hence why we are today.
Another question?
I want to challenge a bit the idea that the old must die, and as an old person, no, really, because I think that we divide ourselves. We're not, the young people are not Prince Charles waiting for the Queen to die. They are able to move forward, and I particularly wanted to refer to, and forget about his present position, Nnamdi Kanu in Nigeria. He became very popular as a leader of the independent peoples of Biafra movement. And suddenly he was being courted by the entire political class. He didn't go through the school, at least by the time we heard of him, he hadn't gone through the school or done anything. He just had command of the youth of southeastern Nigeria. And suddenly, everybody was courting him. Why? Because he had the votes. His mistake was to say, we're not participating in elections, in which case he said, well, in that case, we don't need you. But I think that we shouldn't, I think that power is not something that is handed over. It's nice to thank WADA for allowing youth to be part of the panel and everything. But at the end of the day, you know, youth will be there. And they, just as old people, I mean, I was listening to old people talking about this anniversary of World War and saying, Brexit is a disaster in the terms of that. So even the idea that old people all have one view about certain things is not necessarily, I think, a helpful one to propagate.
Fatima or Soud, would you like to intervene on one of those?
Okay, so on the issue of centralism or centrism, there's no universal definition, so it changes with the politics of the day and everything else. And the same issue, the question that you posed on populism, we're social agents, we're social beings. We are going through evolution. So our social systems need to evolve with times. Is there a right, is there a wrong? It's subjective. But I think the goal is, what are the shared values and commonalities that bring us together? And sometimes a populist idea might be that. In certain cases, it is anchoring towards a center. That center is not constant. It's always moving around and everything else. But what are the shared values that bring us together? What are the shared problems that also bring us together? And it's in an evolutionary process, you have winners and losers. So I think it's how history is going to judge the current generation, the future generations, on how they organize themselves and societies to be able to bring greater good for whether it's their countries or now in the age of globalization, it's not only us thinking as individual countries, but the greater world and the regions that we live in.
And to give my 2 cents very briefly, given the time crunch, while I agree that it's important to define and analyze concepts like populism and centrism, I think that we are, I mean, as a young person, one of the biggest frustrations that we have is that around us there's a lot more talk than action. I feel like we are focusing a lot of our finite energies on definitions and analysis of these ideologies and other concepts, but not so much brainstorming actual solutions to the problems that are happening day in and day out around us. So I would like to see a lot more action on the ground than the talk that's happening.
Thank you. Any more from the floor?
Hi. I just wanted to ask the second panelist in his concept of centrism, how does he, is it just another word for what we used to call pluralism? And how does that, there's many challenges and problems with the concept of pluralism, especially in respect that small groups can have as big a voice as big groups, and that then becomes problematic. So you can have landowners having as much say as those who have been, whose land has been taken away. So can you address that question?
Sure, we'll take another one, so we'll try and
Then one more. And then last question over there.
Yes, gentlemen said populism energizes politicians. Now, do you see now highly energized politician now undermines rule of law, and they receive the big support of the masses? For instance, in Turkey, Erdogan is a populist leader. He done great things, and he really helps the masses. We have also in Turkey elite Kemalist rule. Erdogan achieved great things, but after some time he undermines rule of law, and everybody is suffering in Turkey. Not only opposition, the supporter of Erdogan's also now failing to pay his electricity bill, while his TRT world is become world channel, but the people is overcharging. Government is overcharging people electricity, and the payment is going to TRT. So the rule of law my question. Thank you.
Sure. Last question over there.
Thank you very much. I think maybe we can put a little bit of euphemism on Chumani's statement and say that indeed the old must vacate and the young must occupy. Just that euphemism on that. And then I think it's very evident that young people are shying away from taking their political spaces, and most importantly, they are, I think I can say that we are underestimating the power that we have to change the status quo in our country. So I want to maybe, one of the panelists to maybe give us an understanding what is the problem really that the youth are shying away from the politics. Is it because of this notion of young people disappearing when they speak up, or yeah, whatever it is? Thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you for the contributions. We are running a little bit late, so if it's okay, I'm going to ask the panelists just to say their last word, short and sharp. Yeah, should we start on that end and move this way?
Okay, I mean, there are several questions, but hopefully I can answer them in one. Each country is different. Each country has its unique problems and their own flavors of democracy that they need to address. There is no universal solution. I think what we need to kind of coalesce on or aggregate on is on shared values. And this is what coalitions are made of. If you look at the rise of coalition governments, the rise of coalition politics, and now we are seeing flavors of coalitions, both, post-NATO. What's happening in, with the axis between Russia, Turkey, bits of China, Iran, and you got NATO, and a post-dominant US narrative, because it's clear that Trump has somewhat delegitimized the role of the US as the global, we used to call it the global police, but the global caretaker of democracy. That has been clearly delegitimized. And we're seeing different actions happening in all. It's going to be messy, but it's the time for civil society and all stakeholders, from the young to the old, to get together, and because if we don't get together, we will all die together to find those solutions.
I'd like to say that the challenge of politics everywhere, whether populist or centrist or pluralist, which is very similar to centrism, the challenge of politics everywhere is to attempt to satisfy as many people as possible, to meet the economic needs, and to allow for some type of cooperation that propagates peace across the world. The difficulty is that neither political ideology will satisfy everyone by itself, and there will be a constant challenge of which ideology dominates from era to era. I don't think many things will be wrong if Donald Trump is impeached. I don't think many things will be wrong if Marine Le Pen's ideas don't lead in France. I don't think many things will be wrong if a second referendum is called in Britain. All of these could be good ideas, but they will not satisfy everyone. And that's the constant challenge of politics. And my response to you about why it's hard for young people to enter politics, it's just very hard. The pathways are blocked. Politics is very, very expensive. And populist ideas tend to win because they can galvanize people very, very quickly without being rooted in any ideas of solutions. The challenge for young people in our generation is to exhaust themselves in the search for solutions. One credible recommendation to solve a problem will go much farther than a populist statement, which is, let's kill the gays, which is, let's not welcome the Mexicans, which is, America first. All of those are populist statements which are not rooted in solutions to any one of our global challenges. One recommended solution will go much farther than a populist statement. So the challenge for our generation is to exhaust ourselves in the search for solutions, and then we can perhaps find a way. Thank you.
So I fully acknowledge my privilege of being a resident in Canada, because the Canadian government, our Prime Minister Trudeau, is actually the Minister of Youth, and while we do have an infrastructure that allows for youth like myself to contribute towards policy making, either informally or formally, there's a lot of room for improvement. However, I think that change begins with all of us, and every single one of us who is here today in this room is privileged to be sharing in these conversations. So I think that what I would like as a young person for all of us who are here to participate in is to think about what bit can we do, be it in our business or newsroom or think tank or political office, that will contribute towards a better future for politics. Because we cannot wait for others to take action. We have to take action by ourselves to contribute towards a collective action.
Yeah. Well, just a quick one from a brother there about the young people participating in politics. I think somehow we have to be a bit ambitious and do things with that mind of being ambitious. I think if I'm trying to think if we would have a young president in this country, how long it will take. A president younger than 50 years old, or even 40 for that matter, how long it will take. And I think it will be quicker if young people can be ambitious and be able to enter politics as early as possible and even contest the office, the political office, without fear, without favor. Because what's happening now in Africa is the tradition of the anti-colonial movements, which are the very reason why we cannot be able to progress. But I think if young people can take that task seriously, I think we can go somewhere. I mean, we've got young people like Sizwe Mpofu, Khotsi, Chane, very young people. I mean, even Trevor Noah. What stops them entering politics with clear mind of what to do with the state money? Really, you know that this is state money. You can then deploy it where, you know, you need young people who've got that clear mind. I think it's going to take ambition on us to do something. But I think more importantly is that, I mean, we've got Afrat Gadda here, the greatest South African presenter. I think they've got the responsibility as well to really profile and foreground young people, you know, particularly those who, Rose Must Fall, Fizz Must Fall, and other youth groups that are happening in this country, to say, look, you are leaders, what do you think about certain things, where are you, what are you doing, and so on and so forth. I think that voice is important because it affirms young people. It gives them hope and courage to do something. And I think if we are able to do that, this forum, we will really speak to the question of let's act more than talking. I think we've answered that through Rose Must Fall and Fizz Must Fall. I mean, we've sat for a long time in lectures, seminars, people telling about issues and so on and so forth, problems in South Africa, but we went and acted upon them, and then we caused a serious change. And of course, the Mail and Guardian have got a serious responsibility to really profile young people across the continent. What are they doing, and so on and so forth. And for me, those kind of profiling of stories, really, really strong stories, not extreme successful stories of students who went to do PhD in Harvard and so on, but stories of people who are doing things on the ground. Profile those stories. Those stories will then motivate other young people. I'm the product of reading biographies of people, of what they've done and so on and so forth. And out of those stories, I actually got confidence and got courage of doing things. I mean, I remember reading Vianney Ngalana's biography. I mean, I was still in high school in Cape Town. And Vianney was he's one of the top black lawyers in South Africa today. But then he was still an adjudicator, you know, a South African adjudicator. And for me, his story struck me very strongly. I mean, here is a young boy from Gugulethu who went to Bishop's College and ultimately got to UCT and became a big lawyer. I think that's what is missing in South Africa and in Africa generally, to profile young people and give them airtime so that they can be able, other young people can learn from those positive stories. And then I think politics, out of that can come courageous young people who can be able to be ambitious and take the bull by its horns. Thank you.
I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists today. Maybe we'll give them a round of applause. I'm not too sure what's next.
Lunch.
You'll find out very, very soon. Thank you very much to our moderator and for the wonderful engagement from the panelists as well as from you, the audience. I'm delighted to see there's so much interest and questions. Now we're going to break for lunch. we'll all be back here in an hour's time at 3 o'clock to pick up with the third panel discussion. So see you shortly. Just a brief reminder that you can continue, of course, tweeting #CAF2018. See you after lunch. Thank you.